I was saying earlier to my fellow panelists that last night I got onto that famous search engine, and I just put in the name of several companies, comma, and the word fines, right? And this is what I come up with. I'm not going to name the companies because I might not have lawyers to defend me. But $8 million, somebody in Brazil got fined over false audit reports. Another one, which interestingly involves the Bank of Baroda, which has been in the news this week. £4 million, a record fine, again, of $8 million, another $8 million, somebody fined for misconduct, $5.5 million, £5 million, $5.5 billion crisis caused by a set of professionals. There's an instance where there are 5 so-called scandals all at the same time. Another record fine of £5 million. Another settlement in relation to the $5.5 billion dispute. $6.6 million, $5.5 million, $5.1 million, and it goes on. And there was another item on the news, I think over the last 24 hours, that financial institutions around the world will be paying, over the last few years, a total of $200 billion in fines to various authorities. $200 billion. So, what does it say about the state of the professional assurance givers who are supposed to be acting in the public interest if I look at the URBA website? Because that's what it says, that our job is to provide assurance to the public, that is yourselves amongst others, that everything is right in the particular entities that they are actually auditing. And in a sense, what we have as a task for ourselves, like our task over the last few months of connecting the dots, is a task of linking some of the micro things that we've been learning about in respect of various entities and acts that have been performed, and if you like, the macro and structural factors, or some of them at least, that give rise to or are connected to these micro events. So, what does it mean when the terms of reference of a forensic auditor are changed 3 times, and twice of those, 2 of those 3 times involves a specific list of names of people against whom evidence must be found so that they can be prosecuted? What does it mean? Does that mean you are, in fact, as the Code of Conduct for Auditors says on the URBA website, you are required to be objective, you are required to act with integrity and professional competence and due care, and display professional behavior at all times? What does it mean when a group of companies over an 8-year period provide so-called incorrect information, as the KPMG press statement of 11 pages indicates as well? So why does it take 8 years to work out that wrong information has in fact been provided? What does it mean when you are busy involved, and this applies maybe to one particular firm in the news at the moment, but I'm sure it's a lot more widespread than this. When in the public domains, for the last few years, what we today call state capture, what we today focus upon as rampant corruption, both in the private and the public sector, are known factors. And yet the relationship, inverted commas, continues, as if the circumstances around us are not telling us, in fact, what is going on both inside the entity and where the code of conduct, again, is essentially ignored. There are, as you know, multinational companies, some have become quite famous for this in other parts of the world, who engage in tax schemes every day and deprive the fiscus in various countries around the world of what is rightfully belongs to the fiscus and to the citizens of those countries as tax receivables, and a huge amount of energy and time and creative effort goes into developing these tax schemes. What does it mean when we actually have the moral and professional code that is listed and amended so many times over the years, repeatedly broken or ignored, and results in some of the kinds of things that we actually see today in the public domain? So, Regulation 100.1 in the Code of Conduct that I saw on the website says, and I quote, "A distinguishing mark of the auditing profession is its acceptance of the responsibility to act in the public interest," as I indicated earlier. So, is becoming collaborative in an effort to target particular individuals or serve the cause of state capture or facilitate the disappearance of billions of rands of South Africa's money into accounts all over the show, acting in the public interest? And if you are not, then we come to Professor Valoria's question at the end, which is, what should the repercussions be? And like in any justice system, the repercussions should be commensurate with the crime or the offense. If, as a result of some of the things that have in fact happened, 100 billion rands or 150 billion rands of South Africa's cash finds itself in strange bank accounts all over the show, and I'm sure you can name the places on your fingertips because you've read it so many times, should the repercussions not be commensurate with that? So, what are some of the global factors, or if you like, the more structural factors that might be leading to this? And it'll be interesting to have a debate around this. So one could argue, as I do, that when you live in an economic system which says that you've got to provide the highest level of profits at any cost, you've got to provide the best shareholder returns at any cost, without any reference to the impact on other stakeholders in your system, which we often talk about, then surely one of the consequences must be the kind of collaboration and collusion, witting or unwitting, that we actually see between professional firms, not just auditors, and businesses of different types. And it's not just businesses either, because it'll be fascinating to ask ourselves the question, where have the auditors been when the state-owned entities in South Africa went through the capture process? Where are the auditors when a commission of almost 10%, let's say somewhere between 8 and 10 million rands, is paid for the purchase of every 50 million rand locomotive? Where are the auditors when these cranes that have been in the news in recent days are purchased at extraordinarily high prices at a premium in order to make sure that somebody, as we say colloquially, is going to get a cut out of the system? Secondly, we do live in a world where increasingly, as many have pointed out, and I'm sure some of you are experts at this, the benefits of globalization and the benefits of growth in most parts of the world accrue to a tiny elite. And that disparity between the elite and the citizens becomes reflected, in a sense, in what we are today discussing as a specific set of incidents within our own environment. I made reference earlier to multinational companies which pay 5% tax in certain jurisdictions, or no tax in certain jurisdictions. So there's this famous coffee house, right, which had a turnover, if I remember correctly, of 8 billion pounds and paid 3 million pounds in tax. Now, something wrong in that balance that we are actually looking at. Now, how many other companies are actually doing the same thing? And what does that mean, certainly in the South African context, for delivery of services to the poor and the less advantaged, and in creating a very different economic environment for the majority of our people? So the question that arises in this context is, and as many of you who are close to this profession would know, one of the debates we've had in a fairly hectic way over the last year or so is whether we have auditor rotation or not. And part of the argument for auditor rotation is the question of over-familiarity. I'm sure Iraj and others will actually address this. The argument against it is that, some of our businesses are very complex, certainly in the financial sector, and if we rotate too often, we don't have sufficient familiarity with our business. So how do you actually balance these two considerations out at the end of the day? But what the phenomena that we are looking at currently, both in South Africa and elsewhere, show is that instead of providing assurance, it would appear that some professionals essentially become associates of the business. They become partners in the kind of schemes that people want to get up to in the various business environments. Jim Collins, I think in one of his books, How the Mighty Fall, describes one of the factors that could result in the mighty falling, undisciplined overreach, if you like. You try to do too much of the same in order to benefit from that, and well beyond the capacity that you actually have. Others, like Tony Atkinson and so on, who some of you would know as academics studying poverty around the world, would argue that greed is an important factor, and that in our economic and social systems, indeed our political systems as well, we actually need to put poverty and the quest for better equality amongst all citizens as the central focus of what we need to do as we try to transform our own situation. In South Africa itself, we have our own structural features that make a contribution to some of the phenomena that we are discussing this evening. The structural inequality and the massive exclusion of the majority of South Africans from participation in the economy, even 23 years after democracy, and to something to which we haven't yet found an effective answer, and which then lends itself, as situations elsewhere in the world lend themselves to, all kinds of populism, and that populism results in certain types of politics that are beginning to emerge as well. Secondly, a factor that we have to grant to ourselves is, and being self-critical about, is that once you have the kind of divide that we are talking about, state capture becomes almost an easy job for people to perform, both politically speaking and otherwise, both in respect of economic institutions, and we've spoken about that often enough in the recent past, but far more importantly, capture of enforcement agencies, so that there's never a fear factor. There's never a risk that even if you are caught red-handed, anything is actually going to be happening to you if you are belonging to the right connections and the right camp, so to speak, at the end of the day. So the critical question when we talk about how do we cure some of the maladies that we are talking about is two factors that I think in our own situation that we need to look at. One is the business culture, and the question that arises here, which I think Henny van Vuren in his recent book is actually raising, is there's a particular culture in the dominant parts of business in South Africa, or some sections of that business, that we've inherited from our past and the sanctions busting era. Elements of that DNA still persisting 23 years later? Is it resulting in certain types of behavior which leads to some of the kind of circumstances where auditors find themselves compromised? But equally, if we are talking about what happens to 3,400 people in one instance, but I'm sure there are many more in other instances as well, are we able to actually say that firms are able to command the kind of leadership that is required to change the culture after many years of doing things in a particular way within large companies? And what does it take to actually change that culture? A culture which actually abides with the kind of ethical and value-driven systems that we actually talk about, a culture which ensures that we act in the public interest. And I've got quotations here from all of these codes. 100.8, which says circumstances or relationships that may compromise compliance with fundamental principles have to be considered very carefully. Secondly, 100.10 says a breach in any of the codes must be brought to the attention of IRBA and the senior management of a firm. In the instances that we are talking about of the companies and of the state entity, there have been any number of breaches. The top management get reports on them. What do they do when they did get the report? Were the fees more important than actually rectifying the kind of problems that the breaches actually gave rise to? So, I think the challenge that we face, amongst others, is to ask ourselves, how do you get behavior that is consistent with the written code? And what do you do when you have either active or passive collaboration with state capture and state corruption? And in our own situation, ladies and gentlemen, I would argue that when public interest is ignored in the way that we see in the examples before us, it has very serious consequences for poor people in our country. It has very serious consequences for our ability to achieve the objectives set out in our Constitution, not only in terms of the rule of law, but also the Bill of Rights, which are supposed to be, over a period of time, rights that our own people begin to benefit from as well. The last point I want to make is that these sorts of phenomena, these sorts of misdemeanors, and they're not just aberrations, they might actually be systemic as well, actually have consequences for a country. So many of you would have seen the results of the World Economic Forum competitiveness ratings. So South Africa, we used to go around the world selling South Africa, as I'm sure many of my colleagues on the platform do. We have the best auditing system, we have the best financial regulation, our banks weren't affected. When the 2008 crisis came along, our stock exchange is amongst the most liquid and well managed in the world. And look at the numbers that have come out of the latest report. From number 1 for 7 years, in terms of our audit capacity and audit standards, we are now number 30, if I remember correctly. And similarly, a whole lot of other ratings, we've dropped about between 15 and 30 places in the estimation of the world and in terms of the perceptions of South Africans that are actually tested as well. Is this the price that we're willing to pay? Is this what we are sending out as a message as South Africans, that our systems don't work? Therefore, be very careful about how you invest in our country. And the less you invest, the less our economy grows. The less our economy grows, the less jobs are created. The less jobs are created, the more diminished chances that the 6 or 7 million young people who are walking around our streets without hope can actually get a job or a starting position somewhere in one of our companies. So the consequences are quite serious in terms of the broader context in which we actually work. And therefore, let us not take this issue lightly. I think there are still many other professional firms that are working within the broader ambit where state capture and corruption is quite rampant. And the question all of us need to ask them is, are you careful in what you're doing? Do you really want to be associated with state capture and its consequences for us? Where is this hope going to be created if we reinforce, purely because we can earn fees, the notion of, not just the notion, but the practice of state capture and the undermining of the democracy that we've worked for so hard? And I'm sure my colleagues will address some of these questions. Thank you very much.
Today, amongst South Africa's strength, as an economist in our international networking that I promote, and very highly so, and is receiving a great deal of respect, is indeed our ex-ministers of finance who have come out with courage, with clarity of their values, and they are expressing views that are deeply central to the functioning and prosperity of a modern economy. For those of you who may not know, I'm sort of schizophrenic. I come from academic background, so I'm delighted to be back in this hall. My day job is business in investment and economic research and risk analysis. So for my sins, on a daily basis, I need to interact with South African bondholders, whether they are holding South African government bonds or whether they are holding South African corporate bonds. So the issues that Mr. Gordhan mentioned is really central to daily decision making. It's about the credibility, believability, functionality, and the assurance that investors require to function in a modern economy. But I also want to share a view that I know as a nation, we have been shocked and as we should, and we are focusing on a state capture because we are so deeply disappointed in this institution that is meant to be entrusted with our public resources and rectification of historic imbalances and unethical legacy that we have inherited. But I invite you to broaden the issue, which is not just about the state capture, it's about national resource capture. And national resource capture, in my definition, is about how do we use our resources to deal with not only our issues, but to take care of our future, about those whose future is embedded in the decisions that we make today. That relates to the way we use our national resources. National resources, at the moment in South Africa, 50% of it in the public sector, roughly 50% in the private sector. Let me give you one example where my biggest concern lies, and that brings us squarely back to the role of the audit profession. Our national savings are managed by a select number of institutions. Your pensions, my pensions, and everybody else's pensions, and specifically the working group, the working classes. And I've had the opportunity to be party to some of these decision makings. I've sat on investment committees, I've listened to the auditors, and I've listened to the issues that they've raised. And I can tell you in the past 25 years, I have not had one single experience that the audit report, external auditors have raised issues about the probity, the believability, and the productivity of the resource used in the country. I'm not accusing anybody. I've put them in writing black and white over the past few days, and I invite all the audit companies, and I've had meetings with KPMG personally, and I've challenged them the same issue. When African Bank went the way it went, some of our savings were locked into them, but they got a clean audit. The day before August 2008, before the banking crisis happened, KPMG issued, as well as PwC by the way, as well as Deloitte, issued clean bill of audit for Lehman Brothers. Do you remember that? And the consequences that it had. So with the greatest respect, I challenge the audit profession to prove, not in claim, but in action, that they do have these insights, that if we rotate them, it will cause a crisis. When they weren't rotated, they were party to the biggest financial crisis in modern history, the so-called Great Recession. Where were they? Where are these capacities? I was a member of the audit committee of Munich Re of Insurance. KPMG was their auditor for I don't know how many years, 15 years. I do not believe that I can believe their audit. And I'm not an accountant, I'm not an auditor, but I've been enough around asking common sense. So I submit we should focus on the bigger issue without taking away from the severity of a state capture to raise the issue around national resource capture. Let me give you another example that in the audit profession is embedded. We often complain about the gap between the CEOs and the average lowest paid, is it not? In South Africa, we have one of the highest. In some countries, they try to contain it. But there is a systemic embedded formula that the audit companies call it benchmarking. They benchmark salaries of the bankers, and they come to your REMCOM, Remuneration Committee, and they say, look, this is the the average. And what do you think the executives are going to do? They're going to pull every trick in the book to say, well, we should be in the top 25%. And the audit committee says, the REMCOM committee says, well, we have no other basis to say whether you deserve or not, but a credible audit firm has said, this is the benchmark globally. So you choose whether you want to be about the top 50% or top 20% or top 10%. What does that do systemically? It's arithmetic. The top highly paid executives, benchmarked globally amongst themselves, they get higher and higher percentages. But when it comes to working class, what is the formula? Well, what is the CPI? And then they commission somebody to give them an independent view of actual and expected CPI. Actual is 5.8, expected to be 4.8 because the base effect or some or other price is going to go up and down. But if the workers are lucky, they'll get the CPI. And if really push hard, they'll get CPI plus 1%. In the meantime, at the top level, thanks to the audit profession, they have benchmarked to make sure that the executives do not get less than, on average, 20%. If they're bad down cycles like now, 12 to 15%, and they feel sorry for them. And they have to give them additional share options to make sure that they don't quit. I'm saying it in public, let's test it. Let's go to any sector and see if this formula is not operating, and then sit back and say, for a country that's got such a massive poverty and inequality, minister after minister, president after president, report after report, we're talking about the widening gap between the rich and the poor. But this is partly embedded in the culture of national resource use. This is the way how we formalize it, we structure it, to make sure that the national resource use is captured for the use and for the benefit of the rich. So these are some of the issues that we have to open up. I suggest that there is an ethical issue, the ethics of doing business. Whether you are in the business of making decisions over resources, or whether you're in the business of issuing an audit report, whether you're in the business of expressing professional skepticism about whatever you're going to sign on, or whether you're in the business of McKinsey's. In my view, what McKinsey's did, and I mentioned it 3 days ago to their MD, in my judgment, McKinsey's is a pure bribery and theft of resources. It is 1.6 billion, there is no other way to define it. And here comes another issue that we have to deal with. We are focusing on auditors as we should, but joined at the hip with auditors are the CAs, Chartered Accountants. Because auditors and chartered accountants work hand in hand. I submit nobody in the private or public sector could abuse resources if there isn't a CA involved. Absolutely. The minister can make a decision, can make a request to pay my cousin. The CEO can reinforce it, but it's the CA who has to sign off on it. Otherwise, money does not go out of the bank account. Plain and simple. My question, therefore, is, over the past few years, with the two ministers sitting here, how often have we talked about SAA, the NEL, ESCOM, Transnet, and private companies? How often have we talked about the collusion amongst the construction companies? Right? How often have we talked about collusion amongst pharmaceutical companies, bread makers, cement manufacturers, auto, cell phone companies, and. At each of those helms sits a CA. Who are we training? This is a training institute, right? We are in the business of training human professionals. And we often talk about shortage of skills in the country. Quite frankly, if this is the type of skills that we produce, not having them is better. If these are the type of auditors that we create, if CAs are taken through a process of becoming chartered accountants, and when they receive their designation, and very often their salaries are more than the CEO, because their benchmarking is a different benchmark thanks to the audit profession, then what are we doing? What is, and I understand SAICA has issued a statement, but I suggest SAICA hasn't gone wide enough, far enough. It is not just about CAs at KPMG, it's about CA at every institution in the country. These are some of the systemic issues that we have to deal with, and I'm excited as a student of economics and a student of social science, very excited that KPMG has landed in this position, because it creates an opportunity for the rest of the economy to say, what are we doing with the CAs? Where are the investment committees? Where is the chair of the risk committee? Where is the chair of the board? What are we paying them for? They're getting my savings and your savings and the working class savings to do what? To govern. Govern on what basis? Some ethics must apply here. Is it not? Is it asking too much? That if you're a non-executive director and sitting on a board, even now you don't see problem being associated with KPMG. Then I have a problem. I mean, then no, I can give you the benefit of doubt. But this minister on so many podiums has invited everybody to connect the dots. Has he not? But who should first connect the dots? Those who sit on the board of governance of insurance companies, investment companies, banks, etc., etc., etc. Never mind ESCOM and SAA and other state-owned companies. So we have a real issue here. We really have not just a political issue and a political economy issue, we have a moment of ethical judgment. Do we want to run our society based on ethical values, which we know, based on actual research, based on common sense? And you really don't have to be rocket scientists to believe that if we keep stealing from each other, we are not going to prosper. That is as plain as that. Entrepreneurship, which has become popular in the context of the past 10 years, is another complicated term for stealing from the public. But you can't steal in a modern economy unless you have infrastructure around you, professional infrastructure. You need to have chartered accountants with you. You have to have auditors with you. You have to have lawyers with you. You have to have professionally branded advisors such as McKinsey with you. Otherwise, you can't steal. It's plain and simple. In the old days of colonialism and imperialism, the army would come and take over and mutilate and grab and run. In modern economies, the use of resources or the abuse of resources requires a complex set of infrastructure, modern infrastructure. And modern infrastructure is built around these international financial flows that are highly dubious, but they can only happen if you have really hotshot lawyers with you, who know the judicial differences in terms of tax legislation. They have to have bankers who can make it happen, and you have to have accountants who sign off on the transfer at the last moment. I have nothing against accountants, I've got nothing against lawyers. In 20 years of studying, I've worked with everybody. But we need to be honest with ourselves. Because if we can't be honest with ourselves, we're going to focus on some problem and not, in a systemic way, the biggest problem. Mr. Gordhan mentioned about the systemic consequences, and I want to end on this. Because these are not just politicking and headlines in the newspapers. Our economy is today, based on what we have, should be growing comfortably between 5 to 7%. Comfortably. And I'm prepared here to be proven wrong. We can go sector by sector and demonstrate the potential that we have. What have we got instead? We have a growth gravitating towards zero. And we are happy when our two successive technical recession turns to 0.3%. We are grateful. We must be furious. Because it's the future of our children, and it's the likely retirement age of some of us sitting here who will be affected by these economic performance. So the damage that these things, this set of professionals, that now we see a lot of it from KPMG, we see a lot of it from other sectors, the damage, the real damage, and not the financial damage, the real damage is that we now have the highest unemployment, lowest growing GDP, a government that is running into revenue problems, which means borrowing at a much more expensive way. Those are the real costs, the real damage this architecture of capture of resources has imposed on us. And we need to have a real serious national discourse about these issues. Politics is very central to it, but we cannot just stop there, otherwise our economy will be stuck where it is. Thank you very much.
Well, the auditing profession is one of the most regulated, from how you qualify to how you practice. We have standards, professional standards that we have to adhere to, both accounting and auditing. We are part of the international community. We belong to all the international bodies in South Africa. We adopt all the standards of the international bodies. So we've got the best framework. But I suppose you can have the best frameworks, but you always forget human nature. Because then human nature gets in the way. Because for us as chartered accountants and auditors, ethics and independence and due care and skill are one of our key pillars. That's what we're trained to look out for. But today, here we are. And I must say, I've been quite impressed with the kind of leadership that the profession has provided in this crisis. Starting with ERPA, who is undertaking an investigation into the KPMG matter. And SAICA has come out very strongly to demonstrate that they take what is happening very seriously. And I'm quite confident that the frameworks are there, that those who are found to have breached our code of professional ethics will be held to account. And if KPMG is found to have breached their responsibilities in terms of the Auditing and Auditing Profession Act, they will be held accountable. And I know that as a profession, we are reflecting at this time. We are going back to the drawing board. We'll identify the gaps and we'll deal with the gaps. But it's not just the auditing profession that should look in the mirror. It's the corporate sector, as my colleagues have already said. And again, I must say I've been impressed with how corporate South Africa has responded. How the LSA came out and took a stand and the Institute of Directors and some corporates, because we should all look ourselves in the mirror and say, is this the kind of culture we want to promote in South Africa? I was actually quite shocked when reputable companies like KPMG and McKinsey and SAP were mentioned, because I think we knew that we had a crisis of corruption, but we didn't know the depth of it. We are only realizing now. So I'm hoping that we'll use this opportunity to self-correct as a country. But what has been missing for me is a similar response from the ruling party and from the executive leadership in government. Their silence is actually quite audible. And we've been making excuses around the Commission on State Capture. But to be honest, what is in the public domain is enough and demands that leadership be provided. We don't want a situation where we don't hold people accountable for what is happening, because then we'll be accepting a culture of corruption, and we know where it has taken the rest of the continent to. We don't want that to happen in South Africa. We have been complaining, wondering. I'm one of the people who've been really vocal about the SOEs. Why for so many years we cannot fix our SOEs? But now we know why we can't fix them. And I'm saying to all those who are responsible, we have nowhere to hide. We know the reason now. We cannot accept any more excuses. We have to fix our SOEs because we know how important they are. And in closing, I want to say that, yes, this is a time of reflection for everybody. The accounting profession and the auditing profession is very key to the economy, and therefore they have to find solutions. KPMG has agreed to an investigation by an independent counsel because we want access. We want to know what really happened. South Africa wants to know. So we're hoping that out of this, it will be very sad that out of everything that is happening, and this is very sad for us because these are our colleagues that we know, innocent people's jobs are at stake. If we don't fix this problem of corruption, it would be really sad if we miss this opportunity. Thank you.
I kind of battle to know what to call you. Minister, because I've always called you Minister, and in my head that's what you still are, so I'm going to stick to that, if it's all right with you. I mean, do you really see all of what we've seen in the issues around state capture to be linked to inequality? And what are the ways that you think we should be addressing inequality?
Yeah, you can use Minister of the small n. Although I don't have a collar of any kind. Now, what I think we often do as human beings, we talked about the human factor earlier on, is focus on the immediate and the event-related matters. But connecting the dots does mean look at the structure of what's going on, look at the systems that actually enable the kind of things that are actually happening. Because sometimes you can remove the symptom temporarily, but the system remains in place. And in this instance, I'm more than convinced, if you look at the global environment, that all of the factors mentioned here are very relevant. So, in a sense, what we are saying is all of you need to become revolutionaries, because you need to revolutionize the system. Whether it's a system of pay within the private sector, whether it's a system of corporate governance. So, you have all the rituals that we actually perform. The audit committee meets and the risk committee meets and the minutes are approved. So the rituals are in place. Is the substance in place? Will you actually be reappointed as a director if you keep raising good but problematic questions? You won't. There are even suggestions, both here in South Africa and elsewhere, that we actually have clubs operating. If you're in the club, you'll find your way onto a board. If you're not in the club, you might find some difficulty in working in certain types of environments as well. So that's just reinforcing the point that there are systemic issues here. You can't have accounting / auditing firms throughout the world, the bigger ones, keep featuring in the same way, around the same issues. So there's something wrong there in terms of culture, in terms of approach, in terms of the search for fees, in the same way as the financial sector is searching for yield at this point in time. And the economist here will tell you that that's what's saving many emerging markets at the moment, except something happened, around midday today, when the Rand lost about 1.5% suddenly. The US interest rates might change, and that will bring us to another level of reality in terms of our own existence as well. So I like the concept of the national resource capture, because state capture is about national resource capture. It is about saying, how do I extract from the state and appropriate it to myself, using money laundering, racketeering, and many other things that we all know about. And it is also true, as Iraj has said, that professionals abet and assist in this process. So I made the point in my earlier remarks that, and maybe I wasn't as straightforward as Iraj was, but let me be now, that professional bodies and professionals really need to take a tough look. Because the gap between behavior and day-to-day conduct on the one hand, and principles, values, and ethics and codes on the other hand, is growing every day. And that gap is what causes the kind of casualties that we have here. And Nonkululeko is right. I read the code last night. And it's beautifully written. Really, it's exhaustive. It was done in 2006. It was then amended a couple of times. The latest version is 2014. Mr. Nomvembe will agree with me. I hope I got it right. But the question is, does the conduct follow that at the end of the day? So what are the implications for inequality? Well, if you are taking out, let's say 50 billion rands between friends from Eskom on a 2-year basis, that means that electricity prices have to recover that 50 billion rands. Right? The next time an application is made to NERSA, that will include the 50 billion rand cost. That means businesses pay more, the cost of doing business in South Africa increases. It means, notwithstanding free electricity and subsidized electricity, for example, through municipalities and Eskom itself directly, consumers are going to pay higher prices. That makes the cost of living an expensive exercise as well. And we all know that for relatively poor people or those in the lower socioeconomic ranks, cost of transport, cost of electricity, cost of water are very expensive sort of burdens that they actually carry at this point in time. Let's go to Transnet. I don't know how many locomotives have made their way into South Africa. But look at us as South Africans. We're sitting very calmly here. But we know that 8 to 10 million rands out of 50 million rands went into somebody's pocket for doing absolutely nothing. I mean, McKinsey pales into insignificance here. right? But how many of us are marching to the doors of Transnet and saying, where's our money? Are you still buying those locomotives? Are you still paying those commissions? I don't even know the answer myself. Now, if that activity is still going on, what are we doing sleeping in South Africa? Right? That means as citizens, we don't care. We don't want to get involved. So apart from looking in the mirror, we better put on the shoes that we used to run or jog or walk or whatever the case might be and get onto the streets, because that's what's going to start stopping these people from doing the kind of things that they're doing. But that cost of 50 billion or 20 billion that was extracted, that we know about, there's a lot that we don't know about, means that the railway lines were not put in somewhere. It means that certain investments in infrastructure didn't take place in this country. It means that as a result of no investment taking place in the infrastructure, jobs were not created and incomes were not provided for people as well. You can follow that trail, and that reinforces inequality. It reinforces it also in the sense, as I said, that throughout the world, and I think here as well, because we are the first or the second in the ranks of the most unequal societies and economies in the world, the top bracket keeps benefiting still. And we haven't come up with a mechanism, despite a redistributive tax system and a progressive tax system, which does pretty well at this point in time. But even there, we're going to run into problems, as Iraj is actually saying, to actually find other ways of solving the problems of inequality, which we better do as a matter of national urgency. And if we don't, there are going to be both social and political consequences for that.
Yeah, I think the KPMG report, the so-called SARS report, is as low as an auditor can sink when it comes to the ethics of audit. Not because that's not an audit job. That's more than an audit job. It's an expression of. It is a job that goes beyond failure of professional skepticism, beyond the exercise of ethical conduct. Yesterday I quoted in the Business Day from the KPMG's website, from their own so-called values that they hold dear. They have violated every single one of them, not just at the margin. They've put an atomic bomb through it, and they don't see it. So when I asked their COO, Steve Blow, I said, how on earth can you still stay where you are? What? He says, well, because we've done nothing wrong. You see, it's one thing to do wrong things, it's completely another thing is to be completely ignorant that you're not doing the right thing and defend it. That's a different ethics. It's the ethics of conscious disruption of your profession, which takes it to a different level of sinking low, so to speak, a new definition. I'm sure for students of audit profession and governance for years to come, this will be a case study. And it should be. And it really should be. I feel very strongly as a student. I mean, our teacher spent 20 years and doing exactly the same thing. We spend a lot of time to say, have you plagiarized? Have you done these things? Have you exercised professional integrity, etc., etc. If we don't have in any profession, whether you're a medical science or a scientist, or whether you're a physicist, whatever profession you have, if you do not hold professional integrity for yourself, you've got nothing. Absolutely nothing. Therefore, that's for me ethics. And we need to really concentrate on this because Pravin, ex-minister, said, yes, we go through the shows. And without fear of contradiction, I invite all South African corporates with a distinguished auditor in my presence to come and tell me how many of them go through the letter of governance, but not through the spirit of governance. How many auditors sign off unqualified, going through the motions, but not complying with the spirit of audit and skepticism, and so on and so forth. These are all about ethics. The same way that how many ministers at our cost, right? How many MPs at our cost occupy those high seats, go through the motions, honorable this, honorable that, excellencies, but they do the most dishonorable things imaginable, that our school kids are embarrassed. So we need to draw a line here. We need to stop talking titles because somebody is called the chairman of the board, somebody is chief executive, somebody is CFO, chief financial officer. We give ourselves titles, and then on that title we lose the ethics of our professional standards, whatever it is. This is what I think is about national resource use is about. Whether you are a president, you are a minister, you're chairman of the board, you make decisions about how resources should be used, is it not? And I'm deeply worried that our pensions are, in the context of disparities, they are not in good hands. We need to do something about it. The same way that our taxes are not in good hands. The same way that our public enterprises are not in good, capable hands. And these are all interconnected. For every locomotive that has to go, some lawyers have creamed off something. Some CEO in the private sector has got something that they don't deserve, and never mind that those who are on the other side of the table, on the public side of it, so to speak, but both of them are feasting on the national resources at our expense, at our children's expense. And both of them are damaging brand South Africa. We used to be proud in the international arena to call South Africa as a model of good economic governance, good institutional governance, because ethics was in place. Today we are embarrassed, and we mustn't shy away from it. We've got to pull ourselves from with our bootstraps, but we've got to do it. It's about ethics.
We've all discussed the sort of culture in sort of business in South Africa, and it's been great to see. It's been great to see the pledge from BLSA, calling on their members to uphold certain standards of ethics. But it seems to me the crux of it is not going to be in having a pledge. It's going to be about what the practice of business is going to be. What would your advice be to the business community?
Well, it's really just been so disappointing that South Africa, we have one of the best corporate governance frameworks all around, even in government. We've got so many frameworks, but they've totally failed us. Because of human nature. So corporate culture is really going to be a big thing if we're going to see transformation. And culture is all about behavior, really. How do we change behavior? You can have the values, as my colleagues have said, and then, are those values being lived? Because then the actual behavior is not aligned to those values. And we have to go a step further and actually define the kind of culture that we want. If we're saying in this organization we have a culture of ethics, what does it look like? I'm sure KPMG had a culture of ethics, and I don't want to conclude on what the investigations will come with. But there must have been many red flags that they didn't follow, again, because the letter of the values and the behavior is not aligned. So we need to define what those behaviors are. And we need to go through a whole culture transformation, changing those behaviors. And the leadership, the top leadership of the organization, have to be the first ones to model those values. When it comes to this thing of ethics and corruption and things like that, it's not something that should be spoken privately. From the top leadership, they have to be vocal about, not unequivocally vocal around what their views are on corruption. Because if it's just spoken in the boardroom, people outside are also making their own interpretations. But if you are vocal about it, no one can hide. I used to say at SNG, I don't care how good you are, I mean how much profit you give us. If you don't live our values, we will let you go, and I did let them go. And until you actually model what you say and follow what you say with action, we'll never see change.